Chapter 5. One end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the four-taloned Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats the heads of horses could be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay, and they stamped their feet, and they bit the wood of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzz of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg, and the shouts of men, playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. Only Lenny was in the barn, and Lenny sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lenny sat in the hay and looked at a little dead puppy that lay in front of him. Lenny looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, why did you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard. He bent the pup's head up and looked it in its face, and he said to it, now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits, if he finds out you got killed. He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay, out of sight. But he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, this ain't no bad thing like I got to go and hide in the brush. Oh, no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead. He unburied the puppy and inspected it. He stroked it from ears to tail, and he went on sorrowfully. But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, you done it. Don't you try to put nothing over on me. And he'll say, now just for that, you don't get to tend no rabbits. Suddenly his anger arose. God damn you, he cried. Why do you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice. He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees, and he whispered, now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me. He rocked himself back and forth in his sorrow. Okay, so what happened to the puppy, right? Lenny did to the puppy the same thing that he has done to the mice in the past. He uh, petted it a little over enthusiastically, and since it was so little, the puppy is dead, and now he's worried because he wonders if that'll mean he doesn't get to tend the rabbits, which is, of course, the most important thing to Lenny. So he is very concerned about this. Right? I'll make a little note here. Lenny is concerned that he won't get rabbits now that the puppy is a puppy also. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake, and then a little chorus of cries. Lenny got up and brought the puppy back and laid it on the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. He wasn't big enough, he said. They told me you wasn't. I didn't know you'd get killed so easy. He worked his fingers on the pup's limp ear. Maybe George won't care, he said. This here goddamn little son of a bitch wasn't nothing to George. Curly's wife came around the end of the last stall. She came very quietly, so that Lenny didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up, and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, what you got there, sonny boy? Lenny glared at her. George says I ain't to have nothing to do with you, talk to you or nothing. She laughed. George giving you orders about everything? Lenny looked down at the hay. Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything. She said quietly, he's scared Curly'll get mad. Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting it caught in no machine. But Lenny was not to be drawn. No, sir, I ain't going to talk to you or nothing. She knelt in the hay beside him. Listen, she said, all the guys got a horseshoe tenement going on, It only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is gonna leave the tenement. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awfully lonely. Right, we got this theme of loneliness. We know we found out about this very much in the last chapter with Crooks, but also with Curly's wife, right? Remember, she's the only woman on this ranch. No one will talk to her because they're afraid of Curly, and they think that she's up to no good. Maybe she's just lonely. Curly's his wife is lonely. Nobody will talk to her because they are scared. Lenny said, "Well, I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing." "Get lonely," she said. "You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How'd you like not to talk to anybody?" Lenny said, "Well, I ain't supposed to. George's scared I'll get in trouble." She changed the subject. "What you got covered up there?" Then all of Lenny's woe came back to him. "Joe, my pup," he said sadly. "Just my little pup." And he swept the hay from on top of it. "Why, he's dead," she cried. "He was so little," said Lenny. "I was just playing with him, and he made like he was gonna bite me, and I made like I was gonna smack him, and I done it, and then he was dead." She consoled him. "Don't you worry none. He's just a mutt. You can get another one easy. Whole country is full of mutts." "It ain't that so much," Lanning explained miserably. "George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now." "Why don't he?" "Well, he said if I done any more bad things, he ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits." She moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. "Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell out there. They got $4 bet on that tenement. None of them ain't gonna leave till it's over." "George sees me talking to you, he'll give me hell," Lenny said cautiously. "He told me so." Her face grew angry. "What's the matter with me?" she cried. "Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What do you think I am, anyways? You're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you." So, finding out a little bit more about her character, right? It's frustrating to her, whether or not, why she isn't allowed to talk to anybody. It's lonely. "Well, George said you'll get us in a mess." "Ah, nuts," she said. "What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like they ain't none of them cares how I gotta live. I tell you, I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself," she said darkly. "Maybe I will yet." And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. Right? Again, she's desperate for someone to be able to talk to. Like that. Okay. "I lived right in Salinas," she said. "Come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come through, and I met one of the actors. He says I could go with that show, but I should say my old lady wouldn't let me. She says because I only 15. But the guy says I coulda if I went. I would have been living like I wouldn't be living like this, you bet." Lenny stroked the pup back and forth. "We're going to have a little place in Rabbits," he explained. She went on with her story quickly, before she should be interrupted. "Another time I met a guy. He was in pictures." She means movies, right? "Went out to the Riverside Dance Palace with him. He says he was going to put me in the movies. Says I was a natural. Soon's he got back to Hollywood, he was going to write to me about it." She looked closely at Lenny to see whether she was impressing him. "I never got that letter," she said. "I always thought my old lady stole it." "Well, I wasn't going to stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere and make something of myself, and where they stole your letters. I asked her if she stole it, and she says no. So I married Curly. Met him out at the Riverside Dance Palace that same night." She demanded, "You listening?" So we think about one of the other themes in this book is dreams, right? We know that George and Lenny, of course, have this dream of having a farm and having the rabbits, but Curly's wife has dreams too. And the sad thing, of course, for her is that like by marrying Curly, she's sort of lost those dreams, right? I mean, she's not going to now go on to be in movies. And not that she ever was very likely to actually be in movies, right? That sounds like the kind of thing that would probably just be some line that some guy gave her. But she buys it and she thinks that she's really missed out on something by having, you know, married Curly and not pursued being in movies. So Curly's wife has dreams, thinks that she could have been in movies. It probably isn't actually the case. That's not really the point, right? It's something that she dreams of. I mean, her dream is unrealistic in the same way that perhaps George and Lenny's dream is unrealistic. She demanded, "You listening? Me? Sure. Well, I ain't told this to nobody before, and maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella." And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes and all them nice clothes like they wear, and I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoken the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture and all them nice clothes like they wear. Because this guy says I was a natural. She looked up at Lenny and she made a small, grand gesture with her arm and hand to show how she could act. The fingers trailed around her leading wrist, and her little finger stuck out grandly from the rest. Okay. So, again, right, just to make note of this, Curly's wife also has dreams, not attainable. And depressing, right? Everyone's got dreams. Are they going to be able to have their dreams come true, or are they stuck? That's the question that we're trying to answer at this point. Maybe we should make a little note of that too, right? Is anybody's dream attainable? Right? We're still not sure what's going to happen with the farm plan and all of that. Lenny sighed deeply. From outside came the clang of a horseshoe on metal, and then a chorus of cheers. "Somebody made a ringer," said Curly's wife. Now the light was lifting as the sun went down, and the sun streaks climbed up the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lenny said, "Maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George wouldn't never know, and then I could tend the rabbits without any trouble." Curly's wife said angrily, "Don't you think I'm nothing but rabbits?" No, Lenny doesn't, but anyway. "We're going to have a little place," Lenny explained patiently. "We're going to have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa, and that alfalfa is for the rabbits. And I take a sack and I get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits." She asked, "What makes you so nuts about rabbits?" Lenny had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. "I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair I seen some of them long-haired rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I'd even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better." Curly's wife moved away from him a little. "I think you're nuts," she said. "No, I ain't," Lenny explained earnestly. "George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers, soft things." He was a little bit reassured. "Well, who don't?" she said. "Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet?" Lenny chuckled with pleasure. "You bet, by God!" he cried happily. "And I had some, too. A lady gave me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me, 'bout this big a piece. I wished I'd had that velvet right now." A frown came over his face. "I lost it," he said. "I ain't seen it for a long time." Curly's wife laughed at him. "You're nuts," she said. "But you're a kind of nice fella, just like a big baby. But a person can see kind of what you mean. When I'm doing my hair sometimes I just set and stroke it, 'cause it's so soft." She showed him how she did it. She ran her fingers over the top of her head. "Some people got kind of coarse hair," she said complacently. "Take Curly. His hair is just like wire, but mine is soft and fine. Course I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel right here." She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. "Feel right around there, and how soft it is." Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. "Don't you muss it up," she said. Lenny said, "Oh, that's nice," and he stroked harder. "Oh, that's nice." "Look out now, you'll mess it up." And then she cried angrily, "You stop it now, you'll mess it up." She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's fingers closed on her hair and hung on. "Let go," she cried. "You let go." We know this, right? This is what Lenny does when he panics, that he grabs hold, right? It's what happened with Curly's fist. It's what happened back in Weed with the woman's dress, right? He panicked and he just held on. Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George'll be mad." She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. And from under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. "George gonna say I done a bad thing. He ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits." He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "I don't want you to yell. You're going to get me in trouble, just like George says you will. Now don't you do that." And she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. Then she went still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George'll be mad if you yell." Then, when she didn't answer, nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, "I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "I done a real bad thing," he said. I shouldn't have did that. George'll be mad, and he said, "and hide in the brush till he come. He gonna be mad. In the brush till he come. That's what he said." Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like it is." And he put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks towards the horseshoe game. And then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was grown soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long, with heavy hanging dugs. Talking about a dog, important to note. Halfway to the packing box, where the puppies were, she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair arose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay, with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. That seems important, that sentence to me, that description of her, right? Kind of all of those things that she carried with her, right? Now that she's dead, that goes away. It's also kind of tragic. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then, gradually, time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped, and his body stiffened, and he rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly. And then he was beside her, and, oh, Jesus Christ! He looked about helplessly, and he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. And George said, "What was it that you wanted to see me about?" And Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and as tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." George asked, "What we gonna do?" Or sorry, Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess, well, we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta get 'em in and lock 'em up. We can't let 'em get away. Why, the poor bastard'd starve." He tried to reassure himself. "Maybe they'll lock 'em up and be nice to him." But Candy said excitedly, "We oughta let him get away. You don't know that Curly. Curly gonna want to get him lynched. Curly'll get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last, "that's right. Curly will, and the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down in the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much, I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off," Candy said sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month, and I'll take my $50, and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, or I'll set in some pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month, and I'll have $50 more." So this is this loss of this dream, right? They realized this was never really attainable, that something bad was always destined, doomed to happen. And sort of, he says, "All right, I guess I'll just be like every other farmhand, and I'll work my month, and I'll go to the whorehouse, and then I'll work another month," and kind of giving up that maybe his life would take on more meaning than that. It's really sad. So let's say they realize that dream isn't going to be possible. Um, George accepts, or at least claims to accept, that he'll just work like another ranch. And he said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." And we know this, right? We talked about that Lenny is nice. He's not. He doesn't ever intend to harm anybody. These are all things that happen accidentally. He's not trying to hurt people, right? So Lenny doesn't mean to. He didn't want to crush Curly's hand. He just, once he started, then he can't stop because he panics. He needed George there to help him stop. George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never done any meanness," he said. "All the time he done bad things, but he never done one of 'em mean. Right? Never done any meanness." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They got to bring him in, I guess. They ain't no way out." "Maybe they won't hurt him," he said sharply. "I ain't gonna let him hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunkhouse. Then, in a minute, you come out and tell the guys about her. And I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that? So the guys won't think I'm in on it?" Candy said, "Sure, George. Sure, I'll do that." Okay, give me a couple minutes then, and you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew in his words. Sorrow and anger. Right? He says, "Oh, jeez, messing up my annotating here. Just wanted to highlight these words for you. There we go. Sorrow and anger grew into words. You goddamn tramp, he said viciously. You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd messed things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. Is this Curly's wife's fault? No, but he's mad. He blames her. Is it fair to blame her? No, right? I think our term for that these days is victim shaming. This is not her fault, but he's upset and he takes it out on her. Of course, she's dead, so she doesn't know that he's taking it out on her, but it is not her fault that Lenny killed her. So, Andy blames Curly's wife, right? Victim shaming. It's not her fault that he killed her, but Candy has lost something here too, right? He had this hope that he was going to be able to go somewhere else and have this farm on his own, just like George and Lenny wanted, and he's sad for the loss of that, right? He's mourning the loss of that dream. And he's sad about the loss of the farm. He sniveled and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused and then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. If they was a circus or a baseball game, we would have went to her. Just said to hell with work and went to her. Never asked nobody to say so, and they'd have been a pig and chickens, and in the winter the little fat stove and rain comin', and us just settin' there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. This is sad. Sad for everybody, right? He's lost this dream and this hope that he had. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Wit and Curly and Crooks keeping back out of the attention range. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. And he stood up. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. I know who done it, he cried. That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. Why, everybody else was out there playing horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger. And he ran too. Slim turned quietly to George. Guess Lenny done it all right, he said. Her neck's bust. Lenny could have did that. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. Maybe like that time in Weed you was telling about. Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we got to get him. Where'd you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He he would have went south. We come from north, so he would have went south. So George is lying here, right? He knows that Lenny was going to go back to where George told him to go, which is the direction they came from. So George, he knew Lenny would go north. He's sending them the opposite direction. So he's going to buy Lenny some time. Guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand. And suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George. I know, said George. I know. We're talking about a time in history where people like Lenny would not have been treated very fairly if they had been institutionalized, right? That he would. Slim is right that the treatment for Lenny in jail wouldn't have been good either. Carlson came running in. That bastard stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys. The N-word's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see her, don't you give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you go in Soledad and get a cop. Get Al Wiltz. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George. Coming with us, fella? Yeah, said George. I'll come. But listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He got Carlson's Luger. Of course we'll shoot him. George said weakly, maybe Carlson's lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Okay, so, did Lenny take Carlson's gun? Probably not. Who just went back to the bunkhouse for a little bit to get his coat and his hat? George did. Seems fairly likely that George is the one that picked up the gun. So I'll make a little note here. Seems more likely that George has Carlson's. Lenny's not likely to think like, oh, I'm going to go get a gun, right? Lenny was scared. He's going to run for it. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife. He said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. You stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us had better get going. They moved away. Curly stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly said, You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them. His feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening, and gradually in their stalls the horses shifted their feet and rattled their halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm.